It begins in the stillness of a Colorado morning, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, too quiet, too calm, just before something terrible forces its way into reality. Dawn is barely breaking when officers step into a suburban home in Frederick, searching for a mother and two little girls who were reported missing only hours before. They expect confusion, maybe a domestic dispute, perhaps a worried parent who stepped out with the kids. But what they walk into is a void. A house that feels abandoned, even though nothing is out of place. Shannann's purse is neatly set on a counter. Her phone lies on the couch as if she had just been scrolling moments before. Her medication, something she never traveled without, is still sitting beside the bed. There is no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Only an eerie stillness, as though the air itself is holding its breath. Outside, cameras capture a father pacing the driveway. Chris Watts stands with his hands on his head, staring at the house, his voice low and uneasy as he speaks to neighbors and officers. On the surface, he looks like a frightened husband. But there is something off in his posture, something rigid in his attempt at concern. You can almost feel the house rejecting his presence, as if it senses that something unspeakable has already happened within its walls. In the coming days, the world will learn the truth. How the husband who begged for the safe return of his family already knew they would never walk through that door again. But what the public didn't know, what was buried until later, were the prison letters. Words written by the man himself as he sat behind bars, recounting his thoughts, his secrets, and the chilling confessions he had never intended to let see daylight. These letters didn't just reopen old wounds. They exposed a deeper darkness, one that stretched far beyond the crime, revealing secrets he had hoped would stay buried forever. Long before the headlines, before the national outrage and the horrifying details that would grip the world, the Watts family appeared almost picture-perfect. In the curated world of social media, Shanann Watts projected warmth, optimism, and relentless determination. Born in North Carolina, she was someone who had endured hardship and built a life of success through sheer force of will. Friends described her as vibrant, organized, and fiercely dedicated to her two daughters, Bella and Celeste. To her followers, she was a mother who cherished every moment, documenting milestones with pride and pouring herself into giving her children the kind of life she felt they deserved. Her marriage to Chris Watts seemed to complete the image. He was quiet, reserved, and steady, her opposite in many ways, but in the early years, it appeared to balance them. Chris, a soft-spoken mechanic who rarely drew attention to himself, seemed content to let Shanann shine. Together, they welcomed Bella and Celeste, two little girls whose personalities glowed through every video, Bella, thoughtful and gentle, Celeste, Cece, energetic and spirited. Their laughter filled every corner of their home, creating a world that looked, from the outside, almost idyllic. But even the happiest images can be deceptive. Behind closed doors, subtle fractures had begun to form. Financial struggles had multiplied. The couple declared bankruptcy in 2015, fighting to stay afloat under the weight of mounting debt. Shanann's health challenges added another layer of stress, and though she managed them with determination, it meant the family relied heavily on stability, emotional, financial, and marital, that was starting to weaken. Still, the Watts household pressed forward. They moved into a large home in Frederick, Colorado, a fresh start, or at least the illusion of one. But the house seemed too big for the cracks that were growing. Chris became increasingly withdrawn, retreating into fitness routines and long hours at work. Shanann noticed the distance, but she told friends she believed they could fix it. She always believed things could be fixed. When Shanann discovered she was pregnant with their third child, she hoped it would bring them closer again. She shared the news with her trademark enthusiasm, capturing the moment the way she had captured so many milestones before. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Chris had already begun to slip into a dangerous double life. One built on lies, secrecy, and desires that did not include the family he had helped create. While Shanann traveled for business that summer, she confided in close friends that something felt wrong. Chris was distant in a way she couldn't explain. Cold. Detached. She wondered if she was imagining it, if stress or pregnancy hormones were amplifying her fears. Yet under her smiles, she was quietly desperate to understand the man she thought she knew, a man who was becoming a stranger. Those who saw her in the weeks before her disappearance would later recall a woman who still hoped for reconciliation but sensed a storm forming on the horizon. A storm she was walking straight into. This was the backdrop. A family admired from afar. A marriage showing signs of decay. And a man hiding a secret that would soon shatter everything. The red flags did not appear all at once. They emerged slowly, quietly, like cracks spreading beneath the surface of a frozen lake. From the outside, they were almost invisible. But up close, once you knew where to look, they were unmistakable. Chris Watts had never been the center of attention. For most of his marriage, he blended into the background of Shanann's lively personality. But in early 2018, something shifted. The soft-spoken, reserved father of two began to transform. He became hyper-focused on working out, obsessively tracking his weight, his diet, his routines. Co-workers noticed he seemed energized, almost euphoric, as though he were chasing some private victory. What no one realized then was that this new version of Chris was emerging for someone else. While Shanann traveled on business trips, trying to keep the family financially stable, Chris withdrew deeper into secrecy. He claimed to be working late. He claimed to be exhausted. He claimed everything was fine. But his phone told a different story. Silent calls, deleted messages, late-night conversations that stretched long after his family had gone to bed. The gap between the man he appeared to be and the man he was becoming widened with every hidden step. Shanann felt the distance long before she could identify its source. She wrote messages she never sent, trying to explain the ache she felt in their marriage. She told close friends that Chris touched her less, spoke to her less, seemed to shrink away from their life altogether. When she asked him if he still wanted the marriage, he responded with a chilling emptiness, neither anger nor affection. Just detachment. Just vacancy. During their trip to North Carolina that summer, the tension had reached a breaking point. Shanann described him as cold, uninterested, even annoyed by simple gestures of affection. Her friends noticed her voice shake when she spoke about him, as if she knew something was slipping but didn't know how to grasp it. Even her once vibrant videos carried a subtle strain, a forced smile, a lingering look into the camera, the shadow of worry behind her eyes. And then came the nightmares. Shanann confided to a friend that she had woken from a dream so disturbing she couldn't shake it. In it, Chris had harmed one of their daughters. She brushed it off as anxiety, as stress, as the mind playing tricks on a tired mother. But looking back, that moment feels like a chilling whisper from the subconscious, a warning she tried to ignore because reality still felt safer than the possibility of her fears. Meanwhile, Chris continued to construct the fragile architecture of a double life. He began researching things no husband in a healthy marriage should be searching. He bought meals for two and claimed they were for one. He spent money he couldn't explain. And when Shanann confronted him about their growing emotional distance, he dismissed her gently but firmly, as though her grief was an inconvenience. Friends later recalled that she felt isolated, confused, and terrified of losing her family. She believed the marriage could be repaired if she just tried hard enough. But the truth she didn't yet know was that Chris had already made a choice. A choice steeped in delusion, selfishness, and a darkness that would soon become irreversibly real. These were the signs. Small at first, then undeniable. Red flags waving in the wind, warning anyone who paid attention that something was deeply, dangerously wrong in the Watts home. The night of August 12, 2018, settled over the quiet streets of Frederick, Colorado like a heavy blanket, silent, still, and unaware of the horror about to unfold inside the Watts home. Shanann returned from her business trip after midnight, exhausted, pregnant, and carrying the kind of emotional weight only a troubled marriage can create. Surveillance footage captures her stepping through the front door for the last time, unaware that her home, a place she fought so hard to build, was now a trap. In the hours that followed, the truth becomes murky, shrouded in shadows, contradictions, and the unreliable account of the only adult who survived the night. But the outcome is chillingly clear. Shanann never saw the light of morning. The world would later learn, through Chris's shifting confessions and forensic reconstruction, the brutality of what happened behind closed doors. According to the details uncovered by investigators, a confrontation erupted between the couple. Shanann, already emotionally drained, questioned her husband about the growing distance between them. There is no record of her final words, no transcript of her final moments. Only the devastating confirmation that Chris ended her life in their bedroom, extinguishing the woman who had dedicated every part of herself to her family. The crime did not end there. In the stillness of that darkened house, footsteps moved down the hallway toward the rooms of two sleeping children. Bella and Celeste, barely awake, found themselves swept into a nightmare they could not understand. What happened next is among the most haunting sequences in modern true crime. A sequence confirmed through autopsy reports, psychological analysis, and the chilling admissions later extracted from Chris in prison. By dawn, 3 lives had been taken. The innocence of 2 young girls, the hopes of an expectant mother, the future of a family that once looked radiant in photos and videos, all gone. What followed was the cover-up. A frantic, futile attempt to disguise the irreversible. Chris moved with a cold, methodical purpose, transporting the bodies of his wife and daughters to a remote oil site owned by his employer. A barren, industrial landscape, the complete opposite of the warm home where they once lived. Shanann was buried in a shallow grave, covered hastily with dirt. Bella and Celeste were placed separately inside crude oil tanks, their tiny bodies lowered into openings barely wide enough to fit. It was a disposal devoid of dignity, humanity, or remorse. By the time the sun rose fully over Colorado, Chris had returned home. He showered, dressed, and prepared for work. He called daycare. He texted Shanann's phone. He pretended to search the house for signs of life he already knew he would not find. Hours later, when the police knocked on the door, he stepped into the role of a worried husband and father, rehearsing the lines of a lie he believed he could maintain. His neighbors watched his demeanor with quiet suspicion, noting how calm he seemed. His body language told a story his voice tried to conceal. But the truth was already unraveling. And soon, the world would learn everything. The cover-up began the moment Chris Watt stepped out of his truck at the oil site, leaving behind the shallow grave and the steel tanks that now held the bodies of his family. But the lie began long before police arrived at his door. It started in the silence of that empty house, when he tried to erase the truth with hurried movements and hollow performances. To the untrained eye, Chris appeared calm, too calm. As officers searched the home on August 13, his demeanor was almost detached, his voice strangely even. He opened doors with rehearsed gestures, pointed to empty rooms, and suggested theories about where Shanann might have gone. He spoke as if he were solving a harmless mystery, not standing in the middle of a crime scene of his own making. But something wasn't right. Detectives are trained to observe what people can't hide, subtle cues, shifts in posture, nervous gestures. And Chris was unraveling under the weight of his own performance. One neighbor would later remark that Chris wasn't acting right, especially after watching surveillance footage with police. On the video, Chris approached his truck early that morning, making multiple trips, opening the back doors, loading items quickly and with purpose. The neighbor had seen him leave for work countless times before, but never like this. Never with this kind of frantic, hidden urgency. Inside the house, officers noted the contradictions. A missing pregnant woman. 2 missing children. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. But her purse, her phone, her medication. Everything a mother would need, still sat exactly where she had left them. Shanann's car was in the garage, the car seats untouched. Nothing added up. Within 24 hours, the police focused their attention on the only person whose story didn't quite fit. Interviews began. At first, Chris clung to his narrative. He claimed Shanann had left with the kids. He claimed he didn't know where they were. But even as he spoke, his body betrayed him. Shallow breathing, shifting facial expressions, long pauses between simple answers. Investigators noticed everything. On August 15, Chris agreed to take a polygraph test. What he didn't realize was that this test wasn't designed to confirm the truth, it was designed to expose the lie. From the first set of questions, the results were damning. The examiner would later tell him bluntly that he failed miserably. It was during the interview that followed that Chris's carefully constructed facade began to crack. When confronted with the impossibility of his story, he offered a new one, a lie layered on top of the old lie. He claimed he had killed Shanann only after she had harmed their daughters. It was a desperate, implausible attempt to shift the blame onto a woman who could no longer speak for herself. But investigators already had evidence that contradicted him. Cell phone data placed Chris exactly where the bodies were found. His co-workers confirmed that his story about going to that oil site was suspicious. The digital footprint, the forensic timeline, and the inconsistencies in his words were closing in around him. Every step he took after the crime left a trail. Phone records showed communication with the woman he was secretly involved with, a relationship he tried to keep hidden, but one that quickly became central to the investigation. Internet searches revealed his fantasies of a new life, free from responsibility, free from obligation, free from the family he had destroyed. Financial records painted a picture of a man drowning but unwilling to reach for a lifeline. On August 16, the bodies of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were found at the oil site. The gruesome reality shattered the last remaining threads of Chris's deception. The shallow grave. The oil tanks. The brutality. There was no explanation that could soften what he had done. No story that could justify it. In the interrogation room, faced with overwhelming evidence, Chris finally confessed, not out of remorse, but because the truth had become impossible to outrun. The cover-up had failed. The investigation had spoken. And the darkness at the center of the case had come fully into focus. The courtroom was silent, one of those silences that feels weighted, pressing down on every person present. As the doors opened and Chris Watts entered, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and shackles, the room stiffened with a collective tension. This was no longer the man who once appeared in family photos with a soft smile and two little girls perched on his shoulders. This was the man who had confessed to extinguishing his entire family, and now stood to face the gravity of what he had done. The prosecution had assembled a case built not just on evidence, but on the chilling reality of the crime. They had the confession, the digital footprints, the forensic findings, the timeline, the lies. They had enough to seek the death penalty, a punishment that many believed fit the brutality of the crime. But Shanann's family, in their unimaginable grief, requested otherwise. They asked prosecutors to take death off the table. Not out of mercy for Chris, but out of a desire to avoid prolonging the suffering. They did not want the years of appeals, media scrutiny, or legal battles that a death sentence would bring. They wanted closure, finality, and an end to the nightmare that had already taken too much from them. So the case moved toward a plea deal. Chris agreed to plead guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder, Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and their unborn son, Nico. He also pleaded guilty to unlawful termination of a pregnancy and to tampering with a deceased body. In exchange, the death penalty was removed. But what remained was a lifetime of punishment, one that would ensure he would never walk freely again. During the sentencing hearing on November 19, 2018, the courtroom filled with an emotion that words barely capture. Grief, rage, disbelief, they hung in the air like a storm that refused to break. The district attorney described the murders as the most inhumane, vicious crimes he had dealt with in his career. He spoke of the trust Chris had violated, the innocence he had stolen, the deception he had maintained even as the world pleaded for answers. But it was the autopsy reports. The forensic detail of what Bella and Celeste endured, that caused experienced investigators, seasoned judges, and hardened detectives to sit in stunned, devastated silence. Bella fought for her life. Celeste, too young to understand, relied on the father who would ultimately betray her. The brutality was almost unspeakable. Even the judge, known for his composure, struggled through his words. When the moment came for sentencing, the courtroom held its breath. The judge delivered 5 life sentences, 3 consecutive, 2 concurrent, plus an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of pregnancy, and 36 more for tampering with the bodies. It was a punishment that ensured Chris Watts would die behind bars, without the possibility of parole, without the chance of rebuilding the life he had destroyed. But even as he was led away, shackles clinking against the courtroom floor, there lingered an unsettling truth: the case wasn't truly over. There were still unanswered questions, about motive, about mindset, about what had been going through his mind during those final hours. Questions that would haunt investigators, family members, and the public long after the courtroom emptied. And in the months that followed, behind the walls of a Wisconsin maximum security prison, Chris would begin to write letters that revealed inner thoughts, confessions, and unsettling details he had never shared before. Letters he never expected to be seen. Letters that would reopen wounds and expose the deeper darkness he had tried so desperately to hide. In the days after Chris Watts was sentenced, the town of Frederick seemed to move under a shadow that refused to lift. What had once been a quiet suburban community, manicured lawns, children playing in cul-de-sacs, neighbors waving as they passed, now felt hollow. The Watts home stood silent, its windows dark, its rooms empty, a reminder of a story too painful to ignore. People walked by it cautiously, some crossing the street, some unable to meet the sight at all. It had become a symbol of unthinkable loss. For Shanann's family, the aftermath was not just grief, it was devastation that reshaped the rest of their lives. Her parents, Frank and Sandy, had to stand before the world and somehow put into words what it meant to lose a daughter, 2 granddaughters, and an unborn grandson in one violent moment. In court, Sandy's voice trembled as she spoke of Shanann's compassion, Bella's sweetness, Celeste's spark. Behind each word was the weight of a family forever altered, a grief too deep to heal. They returned home to North Carolina with an emptiness that no amount of support could fill. Holidays became unbearable reminders. The silence where children's laughter once echoed was a wound that refused to close. Friends described how the family struggled with the simplest tasks, sleeping, eating, facing another sunrise. They weren't just mourning deaths, they were mourning futures stolen before they could unfold. Even the wider community felt shattered. Neighbors replayed memories they once took for granted. Shanann waving from the driveway, the girls riding their bikes, Chris grilling in the backyard. Ordinary moments transformed into haunting images, each one loaded with a question that could never be answered: how could someone do this to their own family? Vigils sprang up across Colorado. Candles flickered in rows, bouquets of flowers lined sidewalks, and stuffed animals sat in clusters near the front of the Watts home. People gathered, speaking softly, some crying openly, some just standing in silence because no words felt adequate. The grief extended far beyond Frederick, reaching across the country as millions followed the case, feeling personally connected to a family they had only known through videos and headlines. Those who had watched Shanann's online videos found themselves revisiting them, searching for signs they had missed. Clips of Bella singing to her unborn brother. Celeste's giggles. Shanann's bright smile as she danced with her girls. They became artifacts of a life cut short, moments frozen in time that now seemed impossibly fragile. Friends who had been closest to Shanann struggled with anger as much as grief. They replayed the messages she had sent in the weeks before her death, the confusion, the worry, the fear that something was deeply wrong. They remembered the optimism she tried so hard to hold on to, her determination to save her marriage, her belief that Chris was still the man she had fallen in love with. Knowing the truth made those hopeful messages almost unbearable to read. In Frederick, the shock eventually gave way to a kind of haunted acceptance. The house was eventually sold, but its presence lingered. Parents held their children a little closer. Couples looked at each other differently, aware that even the most seemingly perfect lives can hide unimaginable darkness. But perhaps the most profound reaction came from those who never knew the family personally yet felt the impact deeply. The case forced people to confront uncomfortable truths, about trust, about the hidden fractures behind closed doors, about how easily a mask can slip without anyone noticing. It became a reminder of the fragile line between normal life and unthinkable tragedy. And amidst the mourning, the public's attention shifted to the prison letters, fragments of Chris's thoughts sent to people outside the family, revealing new details, new admissions, new horrors. Letters that reopened wounds for Shanann's family, exposing the fact that even behind bars, Chris was still shaping the narrative of his crimes. The community had hoped the sentencing would bring finality. But the letters made it clear, the story was far from over. The darkness that destroyed a family had begun spilling from the confines of a prison cell, one page at a time. The story of Chris Watts is not one that ends with a courtroom verdict or a prison sentence. It lingers in empty rooms, in the hollow sound of a child's laughter that will never return, in the messages Shanann sent to friends that now read like warnings. The letters he wrote from prison, once hidden, reveal a mind both calculating and disturbingly unrepentant, a mind that tried to control the narrative even after everything had been exposed. They are chilling reminders that evil often wears familiar faces, that horror can live behind smiles and family photos. For Shanann's family, the world, and the community, the pain is enduring. Every photograph, every memory, every object left behind in the Watts home is now a relic of lives stolen far too soon. Justice was served in a legal sense, yet it cannot undo the tragedy, cannot restore the trust that was shattered, cannot fill the void left in the hearts of a mother, a father, and a community forced to confront the darkest corners of human nature. This case also forces a haunting question: how well can we ever truly know the people closest to us? How can love, trust, and routine coexist with deception and violence hidden beneath the surface? Chris Watts may sit behind bars, letters in hand, but the unsettling truth is that the shadows of his actions reach far beyond any prison wall. They reach into our own lives, into our understanding of family, trust, and the fragile veneer of normalcy. As we close this chapter, we are left to grapple with the enormity of loss and the unsettling reality that some secrets refuse to remain buried. The Watts case is a stark reminder that darkness can live in the most ordinary places, and sometimes, it speaks in whispers long before tragedy screams. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Dark Corner True Crime. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the shadows of true crime. And now, we leave you with this question. How well do we really know the people we love most? And could there be darkness behind the smiles we trust every day?